Hello everyone and welcome to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we are going to be talking about lore, so I won't be talking about any of the microtransaction stuff or any of the buying gold or any of that stuff until tomorrow, so just bear that in mind. We're going to be focusing on more lore stuff today. 3 questions. Without further ado, let's get started. So the first question comes in from HD Mika, who said, what's the Sylvari's view on the other races? Are the Sylvari neutral towards everyone, or what kind of creatures are Sylvari? Charr and humans have had their own history filled with war and hatred. Norn were pretty much the we stand alone, only strength is important type of creatures that cared mostly about themselves, and the Asura were the arrogant race that despised other races for their lack of intelligence. But what do we know about the Sylvari? What kind of creatures are they and why? Well, asking simply what kind of creatures are the Sylvari, we could talk for hours and hours and hours. In fact, I already have done when we looked at the blog post that ArenaNet released about the race. So I'll kind of cut that bit off of the question. We'll just talk about how the Sylvari view other races, and in fact how all the races view each other. Because you're right, the humans and the Charr do have this huge history behind them, which came from the first game and can obviously be moved into Guild Wars 2 really nicely. So there's a lot of history and tension and dynamics going on there. But what about the other races? And this is something that particularly interests me because you can slap a load of playable races into a fantasy game, but I think where it really shines, where you really find out that it's a well-written world and there's plenty of interesting lore, is when you see how those different playable races actually react to each other and talk about each other, and how maybe the different cultures that each of these races portray conflict with one another, which is really, really quite cool. So you're definitely right about the humans and the Charr. I think we're all quite familiar with that. They were at war for a long time. The treaty has only just been enacted and there's a lot of tension there. But there are some interesting things about the other guys as well before I get onto the Sylvari. Actually, the Norn, you're right in saying that they kind of say that they stand alone, but that's not necessarily their view when it comes to all other races, them as Norn. It's not like they as the Norn stand together. It's simply that on an individual level, they're quite independently minded, as in Norn value individual strength and valor over much else. I get the feeling that in Guild Wars 1 they were actually kind of setting up the Norn to seem to be at odds with the Charr. On the one hand, you had the Charr who in Eye of the North forsook their gods and they abandoned all semblance of religion and they put very little trust into magic and they shed that all from their society, while on the other hand you had the Norn who were very spiritual and they had their spirits of the wild and they very much cared for these rituals and they put a lot of faith and trust into the spirits of the wild and magic to a degree. And not only this, but you also had the Norn valuing independence and individuals going off and hunting big game and coming back in personal glory, while you had the Charr on the other side who valued their massive war bands and their armies and everything Charr do in these big war bands that they essentially treat as family. And the Charr really, you might not expect it, but are quite a sociable race in that regard, and independence isn't so important to Charr as victory. Victory is the end goal. It's not so much about being independent or having your own legend. It's about victory for the Charr, and that's what they care about. And with the original movement of the world, we kind of heard that the Charr and the Norn were going to be placed very close to each other. In fact, as the game's development went on, we found out very, very close to each other. Holbrak, the capital of the Norn, is very close to the Black Citadel, the capital of the Charr. They're in 2 very close regions, and for a long time I felt like because of these contrasts between the race and because they were so close with one another, it might be that ArenaNet was setting up some kind of tension between the two. That's actually not happened at all. In the end, there's been this kind of mutual respect between the 2 races, that they're both powerful, and at the end of the day both races do value power, so they respect each other like that. And there are a few stories or examples that we've been given over the years where the Norn have maybe allowed Charr through their realm as they go to Kryta, or the same with humans as well. The Norn have generally just stayed out of the conflict between the Charr and the humans, and they haven't necessarily forged any allegiances or found any enemies in the years either, which was interesting. I thought that that could end up happening. But the result is that even though nothing serious ever happened between the Norn and the Charr, they are still quite distinct from one another, which I definitely do like. So I think the Norn are kind of interesting in their views at the other races. There are some particularly cool things to do with one of the minor races, the Kodan, who view the Norn in a very, very interesting way. The Kodan actually think that the Norn are lesser Kodan. They are like fallen Kodan, and that they have gone backwards, if you will, on the evolutionary scale. And the Kodan judge the Norn quite harshly. We haven't really heard much about how the Norn view the Kodan in return, although they are very close to one another, come Guild Wars 2 proximity-wise. So that'll be interesting to see whether anything comes out of that. But generally, I think that's the extent of the interactions between the Norn and the other races. There's not been much said to do with how they view the Asura or the Sylvari. Of course, we learned a little bit of what they see about the humans in Eye of the North, where at first they thought we humans were quite weak, but I guess over time, individual Norn began to appreciate the strength of humans, and I doubt that's really changed very much come Guild Wars 2. You mentioned that the Asura are kind of these arrogant, we know better than all of you race. They're pretty much in that same situation. There was an interesting passage in the Movement of the World, though, that talked about them in a very interesting light, as though the Asura were kind of seeping into society and getting their claws into all regions and races and slowly manipulating them from the back line. I haven't really seen much of that come through since the Movement of the World. I wonder whether there'll be some point in the game that will shine through a little bit more. But yes, definitely the Asura very much consider themselves to be higher than the other races. And in particular, there's some cool history to do with the Sylvari, which is what you originally asked about. The Sylvari, when we're talking about how they view other races, in particular, I think a lot of people will point out that they've got a bit of history with the Asura. You see, the Asura and the Sylvari are very close to one another. The Asura were obviously on the Tarnished Coast before the Sylvari, and the Sylvari haven't been there very long, only 25 years. So when the Sylvari first started to pop up, the Firstborn were around, the Asura just thought that these were plants mimicking sentience, but otherwise plants nonetheless, and the Asura began to be quite cruel to the Sylvari. There are these stories of how the Asura began ruthlessly experimenting on the Sylvari, and I believe they even may have killed one of the Asura, made some of the Asura very, very sick. So there was this initial tension between the two races. Eventually the Asura learned that, hey, maybe the Sylvari are a little bit more than plants, and that kind of ceased to happen quite quickly. We haven't heard much information on why that ceased to happen, which interests me. I'm wondering if there's some kind of cool story there to do with that. But at some point, the Asura and the Sylvari did decide to call it quits, and what's left now is the Sylvari essentially looking at the Asura very carefully and being very cautious whenever they're around Asura. As for the other races, I tend to feel like we haven't had much information on how the Sylvari particularly view a Norn differently to a human. We have had a passage at one point that mentions the Sylvari looking down on the Charr for caring so much about conquest and essentially destroying Tyria and polluting Tyria. There is kind of an off-the-cuff reference there. So I guess the Sylvari don't 100% agree with what the Charr act like, and I guess they don't with any of the races, really, unless those races follow the Ventari tablet as strictly as the Sylvari themselves do. But nothing explicit really has been said outside of the Sylvari-Asura relations, but I'm happy enough with that. I mean, I feel like most races have probably got a much stronger history with one of the others than anywhere else. For instance, the humans and the Charr, then you've got the Sylvari and the Asura. The Norn do seem to stand a little bit out, but they have kind of got this thing with the Kodan, despite them not being a playable race. But yeah, that's a general overview of how everyone views everyone, and generally I feel like there's a lot of depth there, which is good, because you do get some games where there's not very much, and it will be interesting to see how particularly players who are P will start reacting to one another. I think that will be very, very cool. Oh, talked about that one for a long time. I may whiz through these next two guys. The next question comes in from Runeclaw69, who says, how old can the members of the different races become if they don't go around and die in battle? I know that the Sylvari are still trying to figure that out, but what about the Charr, the Norn and the Asura? Can they reach 100 years of age or even more? Age for the races is a really, really cool point, actually. Yes, the Sylvari, to elaborate on what you say there for everyone else, the Sylvari were only born 25 years ago, right? So none of them have been known to die of old age, which is really cool. The Sylvari are also born into fully adult forms, and none of them seem to have aged at all. As in, the oldest ones are 25 years old, but they don't necessarily look 25 years older than a different Sylvari that's just popped out of the pale tree. So there is hints there, I suppose, that the Sylvari don't die of old age, which could be very interesting, or at least if they do, it will take them a long, long time. But we just can't know. Maybe at some point in a Sylvari's life, when they're 60 years old, they'll just drop down dead for apparently no reason, even though there's been no cosmetic change on their outside. It's an interesting point with the Sylvari living that long and nobody knowing how long they live for, because we've also heard that the Sylvari are reproducing at an exponential rate, which could mean that with the way the lore's set up, and we probably won't see it during Guild Wars 2's lifespan unless there's been a lot of expansions come out, it is set up that the Sylvari could essentially dominate the whole world with their population. If none of them are dying except through fight, if they're all essentially immortal, and they are reproducing this fast, and so many are coming out of the Pale Tree, they could very quickly overwhelm the other races in sheer numbers, and that could have some pretty big consequences for how Tyria functions, say 100 years after Guild Wars 2's launch, which is really, really cool. So that's quite interesting there with the Sylvari. I'm sure that it will be written that they do die of old age at some point, or they'll write that the Sylvari simply leave when the Elder Dragons do, because there's a lot of plot there that seems to hint that the Sylvari are only being born at the moment because the Elder Dragons have risen, and as soon as the Elder Dragons have been sent back to sleep or have been defeated, the Sylvari will leave Tyria once again, as if it's a cycle that's happened a few times in the past, which could explain why the Sylvari haven't previously overrun Tyria. This is definitely something I think that ArenaNet will be elaborating on in the future. It definitely is. It's a bit of a big plot hole for them just to ignore doesn't exist. I think they've definitely thought about it. As for the other races, we kind of assume that it hasn't been announced specifically for the Asura or the Charr, but we're kind of assuming that the Charr die around 40 or 50 years old, because they seem to have been set up in that they age very quickly and they can become fully fledged warriors very quickly. When they're 13 or so, they'll be out fighting. And we have examples from dates back in Guild Wars 1 and established lore from after Guild Wars 1 that kind of hint at generations of Charr passing very fast. For example, there was a character in Guild Wars 1 we knew called Pyre Fierceshot, who had a grandchild not many years after the events of Eye of the North, who led a rebellion of the female Charr. And because that was such a short period of time and he'd already had a grandchild, this guy Pyre Fierceshot, we can kind of assume from that just about how quickly Charr grow old and possibly die. I quite like the idea that they die around 40 or 50. You always tend to find in fantasy settings that the races that die of old age fastest are usually the ones that are a lot more reckless and ferocious, and I definitely do think that fits in with the Charr quite well, that they only live for a certain period of time, and everything they do while they are alive is in the name of victory for the Charr. I quite like that idea. As for the Asura, our speculation on this is that they live a little bit older than humans. Again, nothing really official's come out. You can just kind of look at older Asura and match up some dates here and there, though there's really a lot less evidence for this. But again, it's something my thoughts are kind of in line with. I like the idea that the Asura live slightly longer than the humans, kind of for the same reason that I like the idea the Charr live slightly less time, because the Asura are more calculating and slow, and their society seems to have developed a lot further, particularly with their prowess over technology, so I think that fits quite nicely. The most interesting, though, with age is the Norn. The Norn can live a long time. We're talking hundreds of years, a very, very long time. The Norn are just badass. They will live until something serious happens to them. And that's the perfect thing about the Norn, because something serious usually does happen to them. Because for a Norn, it's not about how long you're alive, it's about people remembering you when you're dead. And by that very same token, a lot of Norn then go out and try and do something courageous, like destroy a really powerful worm on their own, and get themselves killed. And that's how most Norn die, chasing their own legend, trying to set their own legend. And because in Norn society, even if you do die attempting something great, you'll probably be seen as a hero among other Norn. A lot of them don't care so much that they'll die from it. So they have the potential to live for a really long time, but they go off and get themselves killed most of the time before they ever reach that age. It's an interesting thought that in Guild Wars 2, 250 years after the first game, we might find some Norn that are just the children of a Norn we may have met in Guild Wars 1. It certainly seems like it could be possible, and that those were just Norn that decided they didn't want to chase their legend. I would love to see something like that. But yeah, very, very cool about the Norn. You wouldn't expect it, but they can live for a long, long time. They just rarely do. Anyway, guys, I do want to talk more about that. I might next episode, but I've been recording for ages. So thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you next time. See you next time, everybody.